got 3 books out, which you can just about see on there. One was an edition of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's son, Hartley's poetry. One was non-fiction about friendship between men and women, and the last took my then 6-year-old daughter to audition for The Sound of Music at the London Palladium, telling her she didn't stand a chance. And she got it. And oh my God, was that a weird world to be in, to become a stage mother. I write about books, and I've also written about kind of what I would call digital literature or transmedia writing. I spent 12 years running the website for the Orange Prize for Fiction. I've got something on fiction, in London fiction, something about Zadie Smith's book, White Teeth out. And just before Christmas, I did my first radio programme with someone that any of you gamers will probably know quite well, if you the sound designer from Papa Sungray. Do you know about the game Papa Sungray? Yeah, for those of you who don't, the video game with no video. And I made a programme with him about a balance disorder and hearing disorder that developed while he was making all that 3D sound. And that was great fun. So I do all those kinds of things, and that's basically, my background is really writing and telling people's life stories in a kind of slant way. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is biography and digital biography. And I've got a specific project which I'll come on to talk about a bit in a minute. And that partly it came out of thinking about why do people actually read biography. And I went to look and see if there was any academic research on that, and I couldn't find anything. I could find a lot of people saying people read biography for this. So, for example, they want to understand the people who've shaped the world, they want to know about heroes and villains, and they want to know what it's like being someone else. So that's all that kind of thing. That's from the Arden Book of Life Writing. But, and it's about morality, it's about curiosity, it's about sheer nosiness, prurience, you know, gossip, understanding people. It's a lot about what makes us human, I think. But I don't think there's been any academic research. But when I thought about it deeply, I thought, well, actually, the main reason, I don't know if any of you are big readers of biographies at all. Yeah, the main reason you would think, I would imagine, you know, this is completely speculative, someone will pick up a biography, is to get to know the person who's in it, who it's written about. And it's that simple process, just your curiosity is piqued, just as when you meet someone you think, oh, they seem quite interesting, I want to know about them. So that, I would think, is the basic point behind it. Okay, if you look at traditional biography, it is linear storytelling, because that is the shape of, it's the way the books work. Books go from page 1 to 296, or whatever like that. And if it's a linear story, you read through. Now, my particular interest, who we'll come on to in a minute, has been dead for quite a long time, and I've always felt there's a slight problem with narrative tension there, because you just know what's going to happen in the end. You know, that person is going to die. You don't know quite how they're going to die necessarily, but you know they're going to, so you know what's going to happen, you know what the end point is. And I sort of feel sometimes that kind of spoils at least the last third of the book, sometimes. And also, there was another issue, which is what I started facing when I started initially, back in the late 1990s, thinking about trying to do a traditional biography of my particular subject. Because obviously he lived a linear life chronologically, in that he died quite a long time after he was born, and did things one after the other, and sometimes at the same time. But particularly because a lot of his work was done before the age of specialisation, at a time when people did lots of different things and didn't necessarily focus on one thing through their life. There were there were a number of different themes that came up that I wanted to give equal weight to, and I didn't necessarily want, and it didn't necessarily work as kind of parallel narratives, and wouldn't necessarily work. So anyway, so that's something that I think I'm getting there on that, sort of after 15 years or more. And then I started thinking, okay, you could do it differently very differently with technology. Do it very differently, the way you do it. And I was also thinking of this guy called Paul Arthur, who's Australian-based and thinks about it a lot. And his thing is that he thinks that particularly online, the new opportunities for representing lives online, they'll change our conception of the biographical subject, of the biographer, and of biography in ways that we cannot yet understand. So that was published 4 years ago now. Okay, and that's something I'd like you to keep in your mind. How do we change it? Can we understand it? So I had a bit of a look around on the web, and I did this last week, and it's come on quite a lot since I first started looking at it. And this is a bit of a representation of what people say digital biography is at the moment. So your digital biography is just basically, it's a website where you stuff all your memories. So it's your digital scrapbook to pass on to people, your nearest and dearest. Or it's a video, which incorporates some images. So it's kind of transmedia, it's kind of multimedia, but it's in the way that it's all taken into one space. And you've got, bottom and more interesting thing, Biography is, that's kind of, again, it's you stick your photos and you stick your images, you stick your video, and you run a soundtrack under it. You've got quite a lot of that. The one project which has just sort of kicked off at the end of last year that I thought did actually give me a bit more of an idea of, I thought, what digital biography could be, is a new project on Nietzsche that they're having. It's an online, and they're aiming to aggregate all the online information about him. And they're currently in the process of trying, and it's taken them much longer than they thought it would do, to do the data modelling for that and get their heads around what goes where. Because when there's that much information, how do you conceptualise it? How do you store it? How do you sort it? How do you organise it? It's a problem. And then that took me back to, thinking about all this, took me back to the whole idea of why people read biography. And had got me thinking about how reading, again, a linear narrative is so different from the process of getting to know someone in real life. You don't start at one end. You don't sit down and go, well, my parents were born in 1886 in Liverpool and then moved wherever they moved to. You don't take your life through from being a baby to dropping dead. You meet people at specific points of interest, whether it's work, whether you meet them at school and you keep through that, and you do have a kind of almost lifespan relationship, whether you meet them at the school gates, and you talk to people about the subjects you have in common. Unless you're completely obsessed with something and you need to tell them something and they've got to listen, whatever. So I started thinking about how one might do that and what you'd need. And obviously the first thing you need if you're going to do a digital biography is that you need to have a subject. Now, I did a master's in late 18th, early 19th century literature and politics back in the 90s. And on the second tutorial, we read this poem that had been written, I think, around between 1760, 1780, but hadn't been published till 1939. And because it was only the second tutorial, I put, rather than going butting in and demanding to know instantly, I did put my hand up and ask, why wasn't it published till 1939? And the tutor said to me, there was this man who went round looking after mad poets and artists in the 18th century, and he saved it as an example of what poets do when they're mad. And so, of course, I was immediately hooked. Yeah. And I went afterwards, who was he? And he gave me the name. So I went after, I did the research and discovered that there's only been one proper biography written, and that was in the mid-20th century, and was very much of its time. And boy, was this guy fascinating. And no one was remotely interested in him at the time. So, time to tell you, first of all, a little bit about William Hayley. He was a man of letters. He was a best-selling self-help book author who refused the poet laureateship. He was a successful amateur doctor and a fearless yet inept horseman. He also saved William Blake's life, was the first person to publish Dante's writing in English, and had a major influence on 18th century ideals of what it was to be a woman and how women should be. And he was a major champion of women writers as well. So, this kind of depicts his early life. This is his mother, who he completely adored. I mean, basically, his father died when he was very young. Well, in fact, he nearly died before his father did. The other thing you need to know about is he escaped death 4 times before he went off to Eton at the age of 13. The first time was when he was put out to a wet nurse. There's a lovely illustration of how horrible wet nurses could be at the time. A wet nurse who was, in his words, deficient in the vital treasure, so he almost starved before anyone noticed. His father then died, and then his mother decided to have both her sons, William's older brother Thomas and William, inoculated against smallpox, and someone at the last minute said, it's a bit of a dodgy procedure at the moment, why don't you just have one done? So she chose the older one and he snuffed it. And those are some of the instruments that would have been done, you know, scratches used to inoculate, scratch the skin, and then you know, stick a bit of smallpox or cowpox in, and you know, you might survive and be immune, or you might just die of it there. So that's what happened to his brother. And then he was sent off to school, to a grammar school when he was about 8. And next thing his mother heard was she got a letter saying he was slightly indisposed. She got there and he was completely out of it, to the extent that the doctor she took down with him to look at him and said, just let him die, you know, you wouldn't want him to live. And she was like, no, it'll all be fine. And she nursed him for months when he was completely insensible and had no connection with the outside world at all. And then eventually, miraculously, he recovered. And the 4th time he nearly died was when he was declaiming a scene from Othello to his nurse, and he got a bit carried away, snatched up a penknife and stabbed himself in the chest. With a penknife that probably looked a bit like that. I found
the way you do.
Sorry?
The way you do.
The way you do. The way you do. So, I mean, you're probably getting a sense that he was quite a character. Okay, he was massively into friendship. This is a picture of his house in Eartham, which you can't really see. That's drawn by William Blake, who was a friend of his for a while. That's what the house looks like today. It's now a school and has been much built on by Lutons in the 19th century. He had a pattern. He did this thing, right, when he wanted to make friends with someone he admired. He would write them a letter with an accompanying sonnet, of course, and invite them to come and stay with him at his house in Eartham. And a remarkable number of people did. He had loads of famous friends. So George Romney, the portrait painter, was one of his best mates, and he'd look after George when he was depressed, and he'd go and stay with him and feel much better. Joseph Wright of Derby. There was Edward Gibbon. There was Amelia Opie, the 19th century woman writer. Anna Seward, the poet. Charlotte Smith, the novelist and poet. And he, you know, and his best friend of all, the person that he said that for whom he described his feelings as being as strong as manly love can be, was top poet William Cowper. Now I think as strong as manly love can be is probably 18th century, for I don't really fancy him, okay, just a little bit. So that's and this worked really well, and he used to advise people on what to write. He himself was already a best-selling author, so you know, I think people were quite flattered to get these letters, and he was quite left-wing, and you know, for example, in the early 1790s he trotted off to France and had dinner with Lafayette, and he was quite out there. Now his most famous friendship, and the one that really did for his reputation completely, was with William Blake. And in summer 1800, Hayley enticed Blake to leave London for Felpham. I've recently discovered it's not pronounced Felpham in West Sussex, it is in fact pronounced Felpham. And he, anyway, got Blake away, and Blake was initially delighted. And he wrote in this letter, he wrote, "Away to sweet Felpham, for heaven is there," and then went on a bit. And he was like, "The bread of sweet thought and the wine of delight feed the village of Felpham by day and by night. And at his own door the blessed hermit," that's William Hayley, "does stand, dispensing unceasing to all the wide land." He was a very generous man, William Hayley. But unfortunately, in a matter of months, the wine of delight turned to vinegar, and Blake's Hayley-related verse became increasingly acidic. So it's like to Hayley. And I always think of this as a time where Blake probably learnt engraving, because I could just imagine him. Hayley is driving him absolutely nuts because he's so interfering. And Blake is sitting there engraving into his notebook, "Thy friendship oft has made my heart to ache. Do be my enemy for friendship's sake." But it did get tempered, the relationships a bit. I mean, because you could just see them and they'd be completely incompatible because Hayley was all this flamboyance, going, oh, why didn't you write about that? Why didn't you paint this? Why didn't you do that? And Blake, of course, was Blake. And that, you know, that just wouldn't have gone down very well. But Hayley saved Blake's life. Because when you didn't know about Blake being tried for sedition, Blake was tried for sedition because he thrust an insolent soldier out of his garden and was apparently sort of said a lot of anti-king things and damn the king, damn his soldiers, as he was marching him up the road to the village pub, the Fox Inn in Feltham. And the soldier got someone else to swear that he'd said all these things. Blake, of course, denied it. My guess would be he probably would have said it, and who would blame him? But Hayley stood bail for him, he found him a lawyer, and his presence at the trial counted enormously in Blake's favour, and sedition carried a death sentence. So there we go. So that was Blake. So Hayley's writing. William Hayley wrote plays, biographies, one novel, which is basically the most fascinating account of late 18th century mores around love, sex and religion, as I think you'll find anywhere if you go out looking for late 18th century books about love, sex and religion. He wrote reams of poetry, most of which, although people are finally now kind of starting to reassess his work, most of his poetry is horrendous. It is unreadable. Not unreadable, it's readable, it's just workmanlike and often very lazy. He wrote 5 biographies, some of which are very good. He wrote essays on various branches of the arts in verse, and it was one of those that contained the first ever translation of Dante into English. And they had loads of footnotes. And he wrote a philosophical, moral and historical essay on old maids, as he do. That's in prose, and that is a really bizarre book because it's a combination of extremely serious, proper research into chastity through the ages, religious and otherwise, and a joke, basically. So it's quite an odd book. But his best-selling work, I don't know if I've got a slide of that. Yes, was the Triumphs of Temper, and this was a book that. It's a self-help book in rhyme advising young women on how to attract and keep a husband. And to give you some context of how popular it went to 18 editions during his lifetime. In comparison, Wordsworth and Coleridge's seminal book, The Lyrical Ballads, which contains the rhyme of the ancient manner in Lines Above Tintern Abbey, which is a monumentally changing moment in English literature, pivotal moments in English literature, went to 4 editions during Wordsworth's lifetime. And apparently it worked, The Triumphs of Temper. It worked at least for, who's heard of Lady Emma Hamilton? Lady Hamilton? Yes, 18th century it girl, there she is. This is a painting that Hayley owned, done by George Romney, she was his muse. And in a letter, I think it might have been to Romney, Emma Hamilton wrote, "I'm always reading Triumphs of Temper. It was that made me Lady H, for God knows I had for 5 years enough to try my temper, and I'm afraid if it had not been for the good example Serena, who is the heroine of the book, the good example that Serena taught me, my girdle would have burst, and if it had, I had been undone." So, I mean, Lady Hamilton was frequently undone, as she is there. That was her background, but yeah, so she was very excited about that. So, anyway, one more thing from William Hayley's life before we go on. You would expect that, sorry, that's not a very good picture at all. You would expect that for someone who wrote the book on how to attract and keep a husband, Hayley's love life would have been plain sailing. Not a really good bit of it. His first love was a woman called Fanny Page. He fell for her when she fainted during his arms in proper 18th century heroine style during a thunderstorm. They became secretly engaged, and their mutual friend Eliza Ball, that's Eliza, ferried messages between them for years. I mean, I think it was about 4 or 5 years the relationship went on. And then poisoned pen letters were sent to Eliza and to Fanny's dad, telling the father, the very protective father, about this secret liaison that was going on. And and also telling Eliza that because of her part, no man would ever marry her. Now, I have just got hold of the manuscript for the memoirs, because there was an awful lot of this redacted by Haley's editor when his memoirs were published. And I can now exclusively reveal, you are the first people to know this, that the poison pen letters were sent by Fanny's older sister, who was a Machiavelli in petticoats. So there we go, that's all we knew. So anyway, Fanny breaks off the engagement and William is heartbroken, but not for long. Because the letter writer had claimed that no man would now marry Eliza, so William, in a fit of gallantry and on the rebound, proposed. His mum then, and what you need to know about their relationship is that he had been her tutor and he had been her sister. She had been his sister, that's the right way around, and he had been her older brother, forming her mind, teaching her, all those kinds of things. And so he decided to marry her. And what you need to know is that there was quite a fashion at that time for growing your own wife, following on from Rousseau's production of Emile, and then followed the Nouvelle Eloise. There was this whole thing, and there was in fact this aristocratic guy called Thomas Day who did actually go and get 2 orphans at 12:30, seriously, and educated them up, and then chose which one he wanted to marry, gave the other one a hat shop, and then the one he wanted to marry apparently didn't want to marry him because he'd educated him properly. So anyway, in 1769, William and Eliza got married. According to Haley, who often signs this letter, hermit, he craves peace and quiet. Eliza is highly neurotic and requires constant stimulation. And also, according to a letter he wrote to Walter Scott, long time after Eliza had died, she wouldn't have sex with him. Which isn't really surprising. I mean, and he put it down to what happened to her mother. Haley's mother was a bit uncertain when Haley wanted to marry Eliza, because her mother had had a serious breakdown from which she'd never recovered after several of her children had died. And Eliza was the result of the cure suggested by the celebrated Dr. Batty, who thought that the best way of curing Mrs. Ball would be for her husband, the Dean Ball of Chichester, to get her up the duff again. And Eliza was the result of that. The cure did not work. Okay, just in case anyone ever thinks of trying that. So they separated in 1789. That was Haley's choice. I'm not so sure about the truth of what he told. Having started reading her letters and seeing how mutually affectionate they were in the first 10 years of their relationship at least, I am not convinced by Haley's saying anymore that, oh no, she just wouldn't do it. So I'm not so convinced. Anyway, they separated in 1789, by which time in 1780 he had had a child with a woman who was housekeeper. And that's only just been, for years it was thought to be someone else. Someone has only just very recently announced that this is the woman. So he had because his son Tom with Mary Cockerell, who was his housekeeper. Don't know whether she was his housekeeper first and his concubine afterwards, or whether it was, whether they were having a relationship. Don't know anything about that. But they pretend that the son is Eliza's, and at least in public, friends know that he isn't. And anyway, they separated in 1789. Eliza died in 1796. Mary's still around until she dies in 1810. Thomas, the son, dies in 1800. And in 1809, age 63, William Haley marries a 28-year-old Mary Welford. Their relationship lasts 3 years before they separate, which apparently for him was extremely expensive. And well into the 20th century, there were rumours around Feltham about a man who kept 2 wives, one of whom was rumoured to have kept manacled in the garden. So there we go. So that's William Haley. That's Thomas Alfonso as Puck, done by that's his son, done by George Romney. Okay, so there's William Haley in a more recent incarnation.